Welcome back to Women's Business Voice and this final episode in our series From Side Hustles to Empires, Histories of Working Women's Lives. My name is Angela De Souza, your host, and in this series we've been exploring a series of conversations between Dr. Amy Edwards and a range of historians. The series as a whole has explored the relationship between gender and work and career in the 19th, 20th and 21st centuries, asking what's new and what isn't about the nature of working women's lives in Britain. The series explores not only the success stories of famous entrepreneurs and business leaders, but also hidden stories of women who made a living in the system and structures not often designed with them in mind. And so in this fantastic conclusion to the series, we're going to be chatting with Dr. Mar Hicks at the University of Virginia with an episode entitled Programmed Inequality, Women in Technology. So over to you, Amy.
Okay, so this is actually the final episode of our series, and you've heard from a whole lot of historians, all talking about different aspects of the history of gender and its relationship to work, and particularly thinking about the nature of women's working lives. And we're rounding off with an excellent episode. Well, I'm anticipating excellent episode. We haven't recorded it yet, but I'm sure it will be. And a really interesting topic, which is the computing industry. And thinking, I guess, about the fact that once upon a time, Britain's largest computing workforce were women who acted as a kind of hidden engine of growth, and that I guess by the time we get to the end of the 20th century, that doesn't necessarily look the same, and that actually this like reliance on women in computing had transferred, and that it was an industry that was much more associated with the masculine and with men. So here to help us understand that particular story is Professor Mar Hicks, who is an associate professor at the University of Virginia's School of Data Science. Mar researches and explores histories of computing, large-scale digital infrastructures, and the relationship of both of those things to wider society. Mar's published a number of books on this topic, including a recent edited collection called Your Computer is on Fire, which is just an absolutely superb name. And also their award-winning book, which is the thing that we're hopefully going to be talking a fair bit about today, Programmed Inequality, How Britain Discarded Women Technologists and Lost Its Edge in Computing. But I guess the thing that unites both is this real interest in using the history of technology to help us address our current problems with digital structures and technology, and thinking also about ways that people have experienced those worlds, how they've encountered them, how they've resisted them. So yeah, hopefully Mark can tell us more about some of this work today, and as well as teach us something a bit about what it was like to be a woman working in computing in the 20th century. So thanks so much for joining us, Mark. We really appreciate it.
Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, perfect. So, just hopefully a fairly easy question to start with. I wondered if you could actually just tell us a little bit about how you came to research the computing revolution in Britain, how you became interested in doing this kind of history. What's your own origin story as a historian?
Sure. Yeah, I love origin stories. And as you maybe would guess, my origin story has something to do with not just being interested in the history, but also working in computing for a while. And I should also mention that my mother was actually a computer programmer back in the 1960s and 70s. And when I knew about that as a child, I never saw anything strange with that. It seemed very normal because a lot of her friends were as well. And that was in the United States. But anyway, I worked as a Unix systems administrator for a while. I was one of these, infrastructural IT people who make sure that everything's working behind the scenes. And, if everything's going right, you never know we exist. And while I was in that job, one thing that was interesting to me was that all of the younger folks, I was in my 20s then, we were all kind of skewing towards folks who were not women. And all of our older, bigger bosses, they were women. And we would have these conversations about, isn't that funny? You'd think, it should be, progress and all. It should be going the other way, and it should be kind of equalizing. And they'd say, no, you you don't understand. There used to be a lot more women around in these fields. And I remember, since I was actually working at a university while I was doing that tech job, going to the library and trying to find books on this topic, and there not really being much of anything. And that was kind of what planted the seed for me to think about, well, maybe I'd like to write one of those books, or, look into this in a more primary research sort of way, since there aren't secondary sources out there at that time. And that was kind of what led me to go back to school and focus on doing a dissertation that eventually became a book about women in computing. And the reason that I focused on the UK context was because I thought it was very interesting. And also because of the way that a lot of the companies who are really important in the US context are still in operation, it was much harder to access the records that I needed in the US context. Initially, I thought I'd do a comparative US UK study. And then I realized, that's actually not really going to serve me in this endeavor. And so I'm going to let the UK experience speak for itself and sort of let people draw the obvious parallels and conclusions from it, because there's a lot that can be applied to the US context.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for that. I love hearing about the reasons why people get into a topic. So many of the people that we've spoken to, and myself included, it's often from some kind of personal experience, I guess, of that leads us down these different paths. But I also always find it really interesting as someone who works on the history of Britain, but from having grown up within Britain, I always find it really interesting to think about what draws someone from outside of Britain to tell a history that is like kind of located in this particular nation state, and also how that gives you like different ways of thinking about something, I guess. So yeah, really super interesting. You mentioned your book. I also mentioned your book earlier. Like I said, it's a fantastic book. But I wondered if you could just tell us a bit more about it. I know it talks a lot about kind of gender in computing. It has this great title, Programmed Inequality. Yeah, what did this project that you started out based on your own experience, what did it end up looking like?
Yeah, so initially I set out to write something that was just about women in computing and essentially what happened to them. Why was there a really comparatively strong presence for women in earlier computing, and then the field gets essentially masculinized in both fact and in image. And so that was what I was interested in. And then along the way, doing the research for that, I was like, oh, hang on, these records are actually telling a much more broad story about sort of national decline and how one nation decided to kind of shoot itself in the foot, shoot its computing or its process of computerization in the foot by really getting rid of the main labor force that was providing computer labor while they were ramping up. And so that was a little bit surprising to me because, I didn't necessarily see that coming. And sometimes the archives lead you places where you're not expecting to go. And it ended up being, I think, a really interesting failure story. A lot of times in the history of technology, at least in popular history of technology, we are kind of bombarded with these progress narratives and, oh, technology is making everything so much better. But sometimes we learn as much, if not more, from the histories of technologies that show us failure stories, either because a really good technology that you'd think would get legs doesn't, or because of, really weird decisions that people make surrounding a given technology and how that ends up creating, if not outright harm, at least a lot of problems.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I always think it's really interesting. It's, as you say, it's really easy to forget the histories of technology or our understandings of technology, that they are also histories of people. And that as much of this is about like society, as much of it is about society and people and their relations and the decisions that people make, which are not kind of about technology at all, really, but about all sorts of other things. Um, so I wondered actually if for people like myself who don't know so well the history of computing, the world of computing and what that looked like and how that's changed, I wonder if you could give us just a bit of a brief run through of what the electronic computing industry looked like and how it kind of some of the broad strokes of how it changed across the 20th century.
Sure, yeah. So, in very broad strokes, the earliest period of electronic computing basically has to do with nation states trying to deploy computers, electronic computers, for essentially military purposes, and in the case of the UK, cyber warfare. The Colossus computers at Bletchley Park were so important because they actually changed the outcome of World War II by code breaking and essentially being involved in an early form of informational cyber warfare. And then after World War II, what happens in the UK and the US is that there's an effort to commercialize these machines and make them useful to many different areas, starting with government and, really kind of large businesses, banks, centralized banks, things like that, and then going on down from there. And during that period, there's obviously a lot changing in terms of what's happening with the hardware. So, like the kind of strict technical story is very exciting. But what's even more interesting to me, and I think to a lot of other people, is all of the decisions that are getting made around how to implement these new what are supposed to be sort of time-saving devices or efficiency measures. And what we see is in a lot of cases, these decisions are not made in very rational economic ways, nor are they made in ways that actually achieve the goals of the stated goals of the people who are trying to implement these things. And so during this period in the UK in particular, and kind of happens in the US as well, you see this effort to move away actually from the labor force that was doing computing work in the beginning, which was largely feminized, which means not only was it mostly women, but it was a group of people who were seen as not really doing much important or skilled work. That wasn't true, but that's how they were seen. And then as this understanding of computing as really important and transformative kind of locks into place, what you see from the top down is an effort to get what they would call a different caliber of person into computing jobs, people who were more management aligned. And now when you think about, management in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, even 90s, you're not expressly saying, oh, they have to be men, but what you're kind of saying is we expect them to be men and we expect them to be a certain skin color and we expect them to be a certain class status. And so that's exactly what happened. But the people who they were targeting didn't necessarily want these jobs at that point in time. And so you end up with this really difficult situation where you're pushing people out who know how to do the jobs, trying to get them to train their replacements. And the replacements are not actually that good at doing the work, nor do they want to. So they're kind of moving out into other jobs, within a few months or a year or something of getting these computing jobs. And so it creates this real problem, this programmer and computer labor crisis, so that you have essentially a butterfly effect going from labor problems to problems for the industry as a whole and also for the nation as a whole, especially in a period where so much was being kind of hung on the success of technology and computing in particular.
So this is like a really interesting story then, which is I guess not only about the experiences of women, but then how those kind of gendered attitudes really affect an entire industry. That this isn't just about, individuals experiencing being pushed out of jobs or no longer being hired for certain kind of jobs, but actually that this has really significant ramifications for the kind of growth and strength and comparative kind of position of that whole industry. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, absolutely. And just to give a quick example of that, one of my favorite images from my research is this image of a woman programming on paper at her kitchen table while her little toddler daughter looks up and sort of, tries to get slightly in the way. And she's programming on paper on her kitchen table. The woman's name was Anne Moffat. And she worked for a company called Freelance Programmers, set up by Dame Stephanie or Steve Shirley, who just recently died at the age of 91. And the the work that she's doing there, it's very important. It's not any little programming task, not to say that, not that all work isn't important, but she's actually programming the black box flight recorder for the Concorde, which is still to date the only supersonic passenger aircraft that's ever been put into service. I mean, really, really important on a technological level and also on a geopolitical level. The Concorde was often referred to as Europe's space race back in the day because it was all about the UK and France, coming to a Concorde technologically, but also politically. In the UK was really trying to show France that they could work with continental European countries so that France would stop blocking their entry into what was the forerunner to the EU, the EEC. And so it was a really important project, and you may wonder, why is this, woman at her kitchen table doing this programming? And the reason for that was because of this vacuum, this degradation in the quality and quantity of programmers at the time. So good programmers like Anne Moffat and Steve Shirley herself, they were getting pushed out of their jobs, or even if they weren't pushed out of their jobs because they were having children, which was often what happened, they were hitting a glass ceiling or a very, very hard kind of actually probably opaque ceiling and couldn't succeed. So what Steve Shirley did was that she started her own early software startup, a freelance software startup that could provide programming labor to the government, to big businesses, and so on. And she specifically focused on hiring the women who were getting pushed out of her jobs. So initially, it was all women. And her company eventually made her a billionaire. It was very, very successful because of this dynamic that I was talking about previously, because of the way that women were getting pushed out of these jobs and there simply wasn't enough expertise or labor to replace them. And so that's just like one little, kind of vignette that maybe helps folks understand the material consequences of what was going on.
Yeah, that's so interesting, and I always love when historians like pick out those particular stories, or you get to see an insight into like what this actually looked like in practice in terms of people's lives, or like an industry or a company. I also wondered what some of this looked like on the other side. So I know you used the term like gender flip, that kind of the industry had this big gender flip where it kind of went from a highly feminized industry to one that like, and I think even still today when people think of computing and tech and stuff, they think of it as a kind of masculine heavy industry. What did that look like at the time? Like what did making tech more masculine kind of look like?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, and it was such an interesting process because early on, like I said, a lot of men did not want to go into these jobs because honestly, they saw computing jobs as subclerical. That's how they had been constructed, as sort of a backwater that, why would you want to do these things? A small minority of men were really interested in computing and the computing aspect of it, but for professional men who were, looking for essentially a good white collar job that would get them eventually into management. Computing was not a natural fit at that time at all. And so what was happening was that those in charge who were trying to get computer work more aligned with management were trying very hard to make it a fit. And so they were trying to get people, largely men, who could manage machines as easily as they could manage other workers, who could go from machine room to boardroom, and who understood the technical aspects in such a way that they could use that knowledge essentially to become better managers, to become technocrats in a sense. And so that's what the people in charge in government and industry were trying to do at this point in time. And they were hitting a lot of roadblocks simply because the cultural impression of what computing work was had not sort of professionalized and upskilled yet. And so you see actually in the mid 1960s, interestingly enough, this desperation to get more programmers into these jobs, especially in the UK government. So they start advertising in their job listings, we'll take anyone, we'll take women too. And actually, you start to see a lot of women who weren't in the field kind of come in the mid 1960s. And as long as they didn't leave to, say, have kids, they're often able to stay in and actually have long careers. So the woman on the cover of my book, Programmed Inequality, her name's Kathy Gillespie, and that's exactly what happened with her. However, I also interviewed friends of hers that she actually brought a friend of hers to the interview, and that friend had gotten in at the same time as her, but because she had left to have a kid, she had been locked out and wasn't able to get back in because it was this sweet spot of absolute desperation for more programmers in the mid 60s that leaded to a little bit of a reversal in the gendered project of the change, the effort to change the nature of the industry, which was more, like I said, about wanting people who are aligned with management, but also lined up very kind of very tightly with gender differences.
That's so interesting. And I think, I mean, I really would recommend for anyone to go and read your book because it just tells this really fascinating story that includes both people who I guess we wouldn't normally encounter or we never normally hear about when we hear about, big histories of the role of computing in society or the kind of rise of tech and things like that. But also there is a story about what it was like to be a woman in different kinds of workplaces and the kind of position of women in society. I mean, the story you're telling about particularly women leaving to have children and then being locked out is, I suppose, a slightly more extreme version of what a lot of women felt in other industries and on other career paths in that period. I guess the other question that I've been tending to ask people is what does what does this history help us to think about in terms of some of these issues today? So kind of are there any particular lessons or things that we should be thinking about when we think about this overlooked history of women in computing and then how we might think about inclusion in those fields or kind of have we come much further than where your story kind of leaves off in the late 20th century? What does this all look like today?
Yeah, I think one of the really important through lines that helps us understand what happened and what continues to happen with technology in particular, but obviously this is something that we can learn from by looking at the operation of power in any context, but power is really the through line. You know how I said Kathy Gillespie brought a friend with her. Anne Sace was her friend's name, who had gotten kind of locked out because she left to have a kid. Well, she had this great story, which I recount in the book, where she was talking about how she was actually doing really well in this period of her life where she was working as a computer operator and programmer. She was doing well financially. And so she actually tried to buy a house. She tried to get a bank loan for a house. And as a single woman at that time, she simply couldn't. There wasn't enough money she could put up unless she had the whole purchase price of the house to get a bank loan. Women weren't able to have credit cards or, really much in the way of financial responsibility in their own name without a male cosigner or a husband. And so she said, well, so I was so upset that I just left the bank and I went out and I bought the longest car I could afford at the time. And it's kind of a funny story, but it's also kind of, it's infuriating because she wasn't allowed to build wealth. She wasn't allowed to do a lot of things that, she could have done because the structure of society at the time and still it's arranged in such a way that certain people are assumed to deserve power and are allowed to get power, and certain people are assumed not to deserve power, and they are really kind of, shoved out of the way of having more responsibility or more power. And the ramifications for this in terms of governance, I think, are really obvious, so I won't belabor that. But the ramifications of this in the tech industry are arguably as important because if you look at everything that's going on with high tech now, um, so much about high tech and especially, tech billionaires or tech oligarchy, it's all about challenging the power of nation states. It's all about wielding ever more power, especially with these companies that have come out of Silicon Valley and have, truly, I would say at this point, almost grotesque valuations. And so this actually is a through line all the way back to the beginning. Remember, it started out with warfaring. That's about power. It went on to pushing women out of the field when they thought they needed more management-oriented people involved. That's about power. All the stuff that has to do with trying to convince computer workers that, they don't need to unionize and they don't need anything that, workers need. That's all about power. And, bringing us up to the present day, I know that we've seen this in the UK, but I'll focus on the US context for a moment here. There are so many white collar, really skilled, really, kind of at the top of the white collar workforce, tech workers now, who are trying really, really hard to push back against some of the really dangerous and destructive things that the companies they work at are doing. And they're having, I mean, I'm so glad they're doing that, but they're having a really hard time because for the longest time, that class of workers didn't build worker power because they saw themselves as essentially coextensive with management. And it's a rude wake-up call right now for them to realize that wasn't it. That was never the case.
That's really interesting, and I know that your kind of current project thinks about resistance, or kind of experiences or ways of resisting some of the power of, in your case, big digital systems. But I guess, I mean, there's a bigger question here about what does it look like to resist when we see something that looks unfair, when we feel that a system of government, of whatever, doesn't kind of isn't inclusive. What what does your new project look like, I suppose, and how does it build on from what you've already done?
Yeah, my new project it's sort of tentatively entitled or tentatively about what I call digital resistance. So people trying to resist these large hegemonic technological systems that they can't really get away from. Rejecting them outright is in many cases not going to be possible if you want to stay employed or kind of stay in society as somebody who functions in modern society. But nonetheless, it's not the case that there's nothing that can be done. And so my new project looks at, for instance, like earlier waves of attempts to unionize white collar computer workers to try to get them to press back against certain things that like the military industrial complex was doing that they didn't necessarily want their labor going towards. It looks at things like how different people throughout history have try to engage in like ethical hacking, sometimes at the expense of their own lives. So that sort of thing. I think one of the things that's so seductive about technology and traditional stories about technology is that technology is the lever that moves the world, right? If you can get the technology right, the idea is you don't need anyone else, right? It's sort of a very binary black and white thing. You can do what's right with that technology. But that's really not how it works, right? In practice, it's much messier. In practice, you need all sorts of things like political and social buy-in and trying to use technology to essentially steamroll democratic processes, which is something we see a lot and we're seeing a lot right now. That's something that has a long history and also a long history of people trying to push back against that. And I think we can learn from that, even though we don't have the very grand success stories a lot of the time that we might like to see. We can learn a lot from the smaller successes and also from the failures.
I think that's a really nice and powerful way to end this episode, and in fact, the series as a whole, of thinking that so many of the things that people have spoken about over the last couple of or over the series have been often experiences of being pushed out of different industries, of histories of small failures, or big failures, small successes that, above and beyond individual cases where people maybe make it big, that actually the experiences of women in across a number of different industries. And we've looked at kind of financial services, we've looked at direct sales, we've looked at the world of science, of sex advice, of all sorts of different bits and pieces. And we've looked at experiences of women with disabilities, of women of color. There's all these different ways where people have found ways to resist, have found ways to make it work, and have kind of, I guess one of the things I love about history is that there are lots of stories that aren't necessarily big stories of progress, but there are stories of like hope, and there are stories of change, and the ways that it is possible to change things about your circumstances, or to work together to change things about the world around you. So hopefully that's a really nice way to finish, even if some of the stories or that we've looked at have not, they're not necessarily uniformly happy stories. But yeah, this also leaves me to say thank you so much, Mar, for your time and for talking to us about your projects past and present. I just think it's so super interesting to use technology as a kind of, it's a bit of a cliche, but as a mirror to help us think about society and the way that society works, and how it is that we end up kind of in the place that we are today. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for it. And yeah, I think that's a wrap, as people who are academic historians almost never say.
Thanks so much for having me and for doing this series.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Women's Business Voice, where women rise, lead, and make an impact. If you loved today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a woman who needs to hear this. Want more inspiration? Visit womensbusiness.club to connect, grow, and be seen. Until next time, keep showing up powerfully. The world needs what only you can bring.